are irrelevant to me on regards to basicality.
Well, they're appealing to non-inferential justification, right?
What is the inferential basis for thinking that the essence of rationality is, or the essence of the project of rationality is looking for inferential bases?
That's a
Well, Helena, you should just look up Reformed epistemology and proper basicality. And I'm sure you can find an encyclopedia article, and that's what they'll tell you, right? The Reformed epistemologists were the people who came up with the idea of proper basicality as opposed to just basicality, right?
No, I didn't know that they're the ones that came up with that. You're saying they came up with that so they could get God in there?
They were, well, I mean, that's to make an argument about their motives. I mean, they're basically responding to objections that were made by atheists, right? That it wasn't actually rational to believe in God without evidence, right? And Plantinga's response was to say there are lots of beliefs that we have that we take to be rational that we don't have evidence for. Beliefs like in the existence of other minds, right? And so he wanted to say that a belief in God could be a belief like that. So the project was to give an account of how it could be rational for a belief to be basic rather than merely irrational, right? Because we might say that if a belief is not justified by any other beliefs, it therefore doesn't have any justifications, so therefore it's not rational, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's irrational, which is what the atheists charged. It might just be irrational, because there's a problem with the idea of saying that it's irrational in that if you don't have some basic beliefs, you might have a danger of an infinite regress of justifiers, right? So the project was to try to give an account of how it could actually be rational for a belief to be basic. And so they appealed to a notion of non-inferential justification as a way of giving an account for how it could be rational to hold certain basic beliefs. And so they wanted to say that belief in God could be a belief of that kind, and therefore defeat the objection of the atheists who said if you don't have evidence for the existence of God, the belief in it would be irrational.
Do you think that, for example, believing that induction is trustworthy is rational?
Right. So that would be another.
It's not even rational.
That would be another good example of the type of belief that is often invoked as a basic belief or as a properly basic belief, because it doesn't seem like. Well, certainly you couldn't give evidence for it, right? Because that would involve circularity.
Right.
So the only way you could actually give a justification, an inferential justification for it, would be by some kind of a priori argument, such as a transcendental argument. But I mean, I think there are some people who've given arguments of that type, like Peter Strawson, I think, has tried to give some kind of a priori argument for the rationality of belief and induction, but I think it's a very controversial kind of argument. I think it looks a little bit like a pragmatic rather than an epistemic justifier. So if you didn't have an argument of that kind, I think you'd be reduced to saying that it was a basic belief. But there are criteria of proper basicality that some might invoke that would say, well, these are basic beliefs that have a higher order of, let's say, rationality than certain other types of basic beliefs, because, for instance, you might say you couldn't really coherently doubt it or something like that, right? That's one type of criterion of proper basicality that I think some theorists have tried to invoke.
So proper is doing the work of saying you couldn't really
Well, that's
really doubt it?
Well, that's one type of criterion that's
Uh-huh.
been proposed for.
What else? What other ones?
Indubitability.
What is proper doing there?
I mean, it just is so as Nadia said, they want to distinguish beliefs that can be coherently doubted, basic beliefs that can be coherently doubted from basic beliefs that can't be coherently doubted, right? And so they might say that the ones that can't be coherently doubted are the properly basic ones, whereas the ones that can be coherently doubted are merely basic, right? But,
What would be an example of one that couldn't be?
Well, like...
Or could be, I'm sorry.
Could be coherently doubted?
Yeah.
Belief in other minds.
Right. That's
so
that's the very one that always trips me.
I think that the Reformed epistemologists, I mean the leading ones like Plantinga and Alston and Wolterstorff, I think that they became dissatisfied with indubitability as a criterion. It's a fairly complicated dialectic, right? Because you see, the point is, Plantinga, well, I'm most familiar with Plantinga's project. I actually don't know much about Alston or Wolterstorff, but Plantinga sort of tried to develop a model of non-inferential justification and therefore a criterion of, well, some kind of set of consideration, because he actually at some point rejected any clear definition of what proper, well, at least as I understand him, some kind of clear definition for what proper basicality is, and rather said that there's no actual criterion that we can point to qualify a belief as properly basic. It's rather that we look at the examples and then pick out the ones that are in fact properly basic. But you know, the project has developed over the years where Plantinga has had to sort of revise his conception, because he didn't like the idea, for example, that it seemed like his account made it possible for belief in the Great Pumpkin to be rational, right? He wanted to say God belief is rational, but then people said, well, then on your view, there's nothing irrational about believing in the Great Pumpkin, you know, and I think Plantinga was uncomfortable with that. So he tried to find a way to show that belief in the Christian God was rational, but belief in the Great Pumpkin was not rational. So it's actually, if you go through the whole sort of history of Reformed epistemology, it's actually a fairly complicated dialectic of Plantinga and others, you know, responding to various objections of that type.
Yeah, that's the link in the side chat to the first video by Matthew McCormick critiquing Plantinga, but as part of the critique, describing what properly and improper basic beliefs are.
That's great.
That objection, by the way, was known as the Great Pumpkin objection in the literature.
Yeah, originally we were probably more focused on theories of truth and interlocking dependencies than, I guess, just the what is it? Particulars of foundationalism.
As I understand it, Plantinga is what has been called proper functionalist in terms of epistemology, which was the same in theological strains and apologetic strains as a predecessor whose name escapes me at the moment, but it's commonly called common sense realism amongst.
You mean Thomas Reid?
Yeah, Thomas Reid, that's it.
Yeah, I don't know. The conversations got kind of dulled down. It's just something Jimmy said earlier that's been like bugging me that I need to understand. Jimmy said that like a properly basic belief or something, or reality. Or truth isn't what comports with reality. It's what comports with God's revelation.
Yeah, I think he said that.
Yeah, I don't understand what you mean by truth comports with God's revelation.
You said God's mind.
Yeah, we're confusing theories of justification versus theories of truth. My theory of justification is that it comports with God's revelation. The theory of truth is that it comports with God's mind in general. Right. So the difference being that God pre-exists the world, but his free choice to create the world is, or inherently involves, his choice to stoop down and become a part of it, and to shape it according to his rationality. Right. And so when he creates human beings, we're created in his image, and part of it, what it means to be an image bearer of God, part of it, what it means to be imago Dei, is that we have created in us or implanted in us an innate awareness of our Creator, where we come from, who we are in the universe.
I mean, there's so much of that.
By we, you, are you including the reprobate in that?
Yeah, Calvinism has never stated otherwise. So the sensus divinitatis has always been taken to be proper to human essence, not proper to the essence of the elect.
Cool.
Do you think God is unchanging? There's so many problems I have with what you just said, right? Because I can't wrap my head around what you're saying. But I mean, even just the idea that God stooped down, right? I mean, if he's unchanging, how can he do anything like that? But if he's changing, then then what does that mean? I hear a lot of Christians say God is completely unchanging. And that doesn't make any sense to me. How can he take actions if he's unchanging?
Right. So let me see if I understand the question correctly. The question is, given that God doesn't change, how can he go from being in a state of, just being eternally who he is, the triune God, eternally in a state of communion with himself, and then also change from that state to a state of creating the world?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, that's good. It's a pretty good rendition of one of my confusions.
Sure. Okay. So what I would say is, I don't believe that God does. I don't believe that is a state of change. I think that God's choice to create the world is eternal, because of another doctrine which has caused great controversy, which is called the doctrine of divine simplicity. I don't think that God's properties are ontologically distinct from his existence.
Why do you think that?
Well, there's different ways to argue it. I think that it is stated in Scripture, but an easy way to understand it is, if you believe the doctrine of aseity, which is that God is independent, he does not refer to or invoke anything outside of himself in order to be what he is, who he is, that he is, then God cannot depend on other things. He cannot rely on anything in creation in order to have his properties. But what that means is then the only existence which grounds his properties is himself. So in the way that a flower can be red or blue or yellow, there's this property that precedes or transcends the flower, and the flower can partake in it. God cannot do that. God's properties cannot be something that he partakes in outside of himself, but rather they just are who he is. They just are himself.
But are you putting together aseity with divine simplicity?
They entail one another, yes.
I thought divine simplicity is that the properties of God, that there's no differentiation between the properties of God.
No, there's no ontological separation, but there is certainly predicative distinction between them. no one would say that God's holiness is his condescension. No one would say that God's justice is his mercy, right? But what we would say is that the extensionality of those statements is all the same, so that there's no distinction in God's essence. Right? The intentionality of the statements or the content of the statements is different. But in God,
but ontologically speaking, there is God. There is not God and his properties, and different properties distinct from each other.
well, no, there are properties distinct. That's exactly what I'm saying. There are properties distinct from each other. There are no properties which are found in God and are found in anything else, right? And so because of that, whenever you talk about God's properties, you just happen to be talking about just God.
I just want to, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off there. I just want to get in real quick and say, I'm sorry, Gus, I was a jackass before.
Yeah, because both Plantinga and Craig reject divine simplicity, but Craig will argue for the aseity and make a distinction between the aseity and divine simplicity. And I think Plantinga follows suit on that.
Actually, I think Plantinga was the one who dropped that ball first.
Craig tends to follow Plantinga's.
I don't think Plantinga accepts aseity because he takes the first horn of the Euthyphro dilemma, from what I understand.
He doesn't believe in the classical idea of aseity now, which is what I'm purporting. He calls it a dark saying indeed. Those are his words about it. But I guess that doesn't surprise me. It's very unique to the Calvinist tradition that God is taken to be a say. That doctrine is almost universally denied or expended outside of Calvinistic tradition.
Wait, you're talking about divine simplicity? And
no, aseity.
Catholics don't hold to it?
Aquinas did, but the problem with Aquinas is that he believed in a form of analogical language that ultimately contradicts his view of aseity. Namely, that he was a straight realist. There was no qualification about it. He believed that human statements were improper in their form about God, because the finite is attempting to predicate about the infinite, but that the content of the statements was still true due to the fact that we're talking about reality. The problem being that then God becomes predicable because he partakes in this more general concept of reality, rather than the Reformed point of view, which is that we can predicate of God because we have his revelation in human format.
Sorry, Bob, did you say you would drop because Josh, I think he had a technical problem and...
No, let Bob stay. I'm gonna hop off. I gotta go to the gym. Bye, guys.
Bye.
All right, yeah, no problem. If anybody else wants in too, I can. Like I said, I'm not contributing, so I could drop.
I'll hop out too.
Yeah, you guys will just have to speak up because I don't have side channel on my cell phone, so I couldn't see if anybody typed anything. But like I said, if anybody wants it, let me know. If the room's full, if the room is not full, then I'm gonna stay.
Helena, they appeal to an externalist. One way they try to do it is to appeal to an externalist notion of knowledge. So and something like the idea that if beliefs are produced by a mechanism that reliably gives you true beliefs, then that would be a ground for a belief to be properly basic rather than merely basic. I think that's one type of example.
So I'm trying to make that fit with, for example, trusting induction. So that the belief that induction is going to be trustworthy or is trustworthy.
Well, yeah. So I think they might appeal to things like God endowing you with certain beliefs and stuff like that.
Well, I think that for example, I think I assume induction is trustworthy. I think I don't have any justification for it. I think if I was going to try to justify it, I would use induction to do it. So that's silly. So I just assume it. But I don't. But that's okay, right? How come that is not a properly basic belief for me? Like, what's wrong with calling it that?
But the general reliability of your reasoning is a properly basic belief.
Yeah, but I just want to talk about thinking induction is trustworthy and whether or not it's right or wrong for me to say that that's a properly basic belief that I have. Because I kind of just am calling all of these assumptions I think we all share that we can't justify without circularity. I'm just sort of going ahead and calling them, unjustified assumptions, or if you want, properly basic beliefs. So, and I'm not going to go to a God to find grounding somewhere else.
Why not just call them basic beliefs in that case?
So I thought that the properly meant that they're legit, right? That they really are at the bottom. But obviously that was just
no. Basic means not justified by any other belief. So properly basic is going to be some further constraint than that it's not justified. It's going to have some type of non-inferential justification, a justification not in terms of it being justified by virtue of some other belief that supports it, right?
Right, so for properly, it means that it has a justification, just not an inferential one.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And the only examples are like this. Well, for the example of induction, you'd have to go to a God or something.
No, I don't know. You might be able to give an account in terms of how it's indubitable, or some other type of rationality. I mean, you'd have to propose a criterion of what proper basicality is, and then say, well, you'd have to propose some criterion in virtue of which something would count as properly basic. What would the rationality, what would the non-inferential justification be? And then you could show how belief in the uniformity of nature would be a belief of that kind. I'm sure there are people who've tried to give arguments like that.
Bonjour is a good example.
Yeah, as I say, I think Peter Strawson has an argument like that.
There's many realists outside of realism is far more prevalent than theism or Christian theism, but the issue is that we really have to be clear about what we're talking about when we say that the question of induction is what is, or the problem of induction is what's in survey, because that is not the same as the uniformity of nature. Uniformity of nature is an idea that is proposed to answer the problem of induction, but the problem of induction is just the question whether or not inductive arguments, especially the kind of probabilistic conclusions that you come through or come to through experience of a given referent, are reliable, are valid arguments.
Yeah, But those two are going to be closely related, because the idea is going to be that induction can't be justified without an assumption of the uniformity of nature, which would then be then there would be a further question as to what justifies that, and you couldn't use inductive appeals such as it's worked in the past to justify it that way. So the question would be, is there a way to offer some kind of justification for belief in or an assumption of the uniformity of nature?
That's fair, but I think the uniformity of nature is it's used by Christians, and that is part of the issue with that whole problem that's brought up, is that some language is the same, the forms are the same, but the content is different. When the Christian apologist is using uniformity of nature, the distinction is that the uniformity of nature is explicitly the result of the divine mind of God determining things, rather than some naturalistic explanation. In other words, the concept of using the uniformity of nature and then trying to justify that as if it were something in and of itself is not a two-step route for a Christian apologist.
Oh, that's fine. I was just invoking Hume's concept. I can't speak about how, somebody like Van Til or something. I don't know anything about that.
Hey, Josh, are you there? I had a question for you about something you said earlier.
Yeah.
What is the inferential basis for the concept or the belief that the project of rationality is to seek inferential bases?
I don't think there is one.
Okay, but then doesn't that reduce one's decision to be rational or irrational to an irrational decision?
I don't think that you can make. Well, I think even the project of decision making assumes rationality, so I don't think it can be a type of decision.
Well, you would say that people can be irrational, though, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we would agree that people, presuppose that the concept of agency is.
Real quick, what I'm saying is that people don't choose to be irrational, though. That's the point.
Well, then why are people irrational?
I don't know. You might appeal to some psychological facts. Not really. I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, but without follow-up qualification, isn't that just a contradiction? I mean, if you're going to say that people don't make a choice to be irrational,
yeah,
and people are obviously choosing to be irrational, is that not just a contradiction?
No, I don't think that's what we would consider a choice, right? There might be an equivocation on what we're talking about when we're talking about choice.
He's saying something like they can act irrationally without or behave irrationally without choosing to be irrational.
Okay, but
he might appeal to, for example, a causal disposition to behave a certain way, right? Which would be irrational, and that behavior might be inconsistent with beliefs and desires of the agent, which would make it irrational with respect to those beliefs and desires. But the point is, it wouldn't actually be chosen. Which is
but
behavior that was caused.
Right. The problem is that when someone commits an act which is irrational, it is their choice, even if not self-consciously so. And then the other problem is that there are many historical examples, innumerable, where people have explicitly chosen to be irrational.
Well, that would be to beg the question against the view, I think.
so it doesn't comport to history?
I think you'd have to. I think you'd have to show that those actually constitute choices rather than mere avowals of choice, or something like that.
Well, I take it to be making a choice is to be acting rationally, right? Because I mean, the idea is that when you're making a choice, you see that there are being two options, and if you act consistently with this option, then you're choosing to act in accord with it, right? I mean, so like the idea is that you're making a rational decision. So, like that would mean it would be rational to be irrational, right? In some respects, and so I take that to be the idea is presupposing that there is rationality there.
Okay, okay, maybe it's a problem then with our concepts of inference then. What is rational about considering those options and then taking one versus taking one that is in comportation with truth?
Well, again, I think there's also an equivocation on the type of rationality, right? Like what you're talking about in decision making is a type of practical rationality, like what's going to guide your decision making, as opposed to inferential rationality or epistemic rationality, right? Like what follows from whatever premises, right? And so I don't think the project of choice is going to involve practical rationality, right? Or I don't understand how one could make a choice without involving practical rationality. It seems like you have to have beliefs, and those beliefs that acting this way will conduce to a certain aim you have. So in that sense, it's going to be rational for you to act in that way, right?
But
So,
then
I
I'm
mean,
confused because your statement about rationality being a project seeking inferential bases was not about the practice of agency, but was actually about epistemology. So it seems the distinction you just made your original statement irrelevant.
I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you're characterizing the dialectic so far, because I thought the point of you bringing up when I said okay, when I said rationality is the basis of inferences or whatever, right? Like, let me just think like about what we were talking about before. You were talking about proper basicality, right? And so what I was saying is I don't understand for what it means to be rational, and let's just say rational in the epistemic sense, for people to have beliefs that are not inferentially arrived at, right? That's the dialectic up to that point. And then you asked, well, what about in cases when people choose to be irrational, right? And I said, I rejected that, right, because I don't think that the choice is the type of epistemic rationality that I was talking about the first time, and it does presuppose some type of rationality, but that type of rationality is a sort of practical view of rationality, right?
Let me define the terms as I see them being used here. You could talk about rationality in the sense of rules of inference or laws of logic. These are principles of thought, right? They're normative standards to which
Right.
true thought ought to be conducted. Then there is rationality in the sense of a faculty of our existence. It is an innate ability to do something, namely to act in accord with those principles just mentioned. And then there is rationality in the sense of actually of an actual incurment of the process taken where we act in accord with those principles. So there's the principles, there's the ability to follow them, and then there is following them. But when you said rationality is the project of seeking inferential bases, and you were basically commenting, you're making an incredulity comment about Matt's foundationalism. What I find odd about that is, well, how is that standard self-consistent? What rational basis? What rational basis is there of the inferential sort for thinking that claim itself? And then I don't understand the response about intentionality and agency, because that doesn't have to do with justification and epistemology. That just has to do with
well, you asked a
agency.
question about decision making, right? And when you asked the question initially, when you said when you asked the question initially, you said something like, well, what's the inference that leads you to arrive at what rationality is based on inferences? That was the question. That was something like the question you initially asked, right? Am I characterizing that correctly?
Let me make sure I get this straight. So what I was saying is, I was asking you, what is the basis for the inference to the idea that rationality just is that process,
Right,
that
and so
an intention toward that process.
right, and so my response was that I didn't have an account for that. And then in response to that, you said, well, what about when people choose to be irrational?
Right.
And then I gave the answer. What I was talking about is I think in that instance there's an equivocation on rationality, right?
That equivocation being,
Well, the difference between practical rationality and epistemic rationality.
okay, but I don't think the distinction exists there. For if somebody is saying, I am going to believe that nothing exists, that has import both for epistemology as well as for the practice of life. So I don't know what distinction is being made there between practical rationality and epistemic rationality. The epistemic irrationality of the person is something they tend to take on.
Let me clarify it. Being practically irrational satisfies some desire. That's what it means to be practically rational, to act in a way that satisfies some desire, right? And epistemic rationality has to do with justifications. So you can have an instance of one, you actually have an instance of both, right? Let's say I want to believe that God exists, and it is in fact the case that God exists, and I want to have a good argument, right? And people start realizing that the more often people hit their head against trees, the more often they come up with justifications for belief in God that are good justifications. So in that sense, it would be practically rational for me to hit my head on a tree, right? But that doesn't mean that hitting my head on a tree is a good inference to the fact that God exists, right? It just satisfies some desire. So what I mean by practical rationality is that it satisfies some desire, right? And what I mean by epistemic rationality is consistent with the epistemic norms, right? Which I just take
Excellent.
to be
right. So, but what I'm saying is, it seems then that your behavior of thinking that this sort of rationality just is the project of seeking inferential bases actually devolves, or it reduces to the second kind, because you cannot give an account as to that statement itself. So it's just a practical rationality.
I don't see how that follows.
Well, by its very nature, if our standard is that
Well,
we
can you
expect
outline
or
I'm
seek,
asking you to outline the reduction.
right? So if you're intending to seek out justifications for belief, right, sufficient reason for a belief of the epistemic kind, that is, of the kind that comports to rules of inference, laws of logic, those types of things, these norms of reasoning. But the only account you can give for holding that belief is your desire, then the whole system
I didn't give an account. I told you that I didn't have an account.
But you do have desire to hold that, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so you hold that belief in accord with practical reason, but not in accord with epistemic reason.
I don't think I'm holding the belief in accordance with some desire I have, right? I think I just happen to be in accord with that desire, right? But I don't think And I mean, I assume that taking rational action, like let's say I wanted to know what the norms of rationality are, right? And then I would suppose I would have to go and read about what they typically are thought to be and stuff like that. Those would be practically rational actions, right? But it doesn't follow from that that just because I have the desire that that's what that me having that desire, that's the nature of those norms, right? The nature of those norms is going to be something like, I mean, like I said, I don't know how to give an inference to those norms, right? I just assume those norms, the norms of epistemic rationality, as the basis of my inferences, right? And so that's what I understand the project of rationality to be. And if someone else wanted to say that they understand the project of rationality to be something different, I mean, that would be fine. We'd have to discuss whether or not it's a terminological dispute, whether or not they share some properties. But me not being able to give an epistemic account for my epistemology doesn't account against my epistemology.
It does if your standard is that rationality, in terms of epistemology at least, is just looking for justifications, but you're unwilling to have a justification, to provide a justification for that statement.
Well, like I don't understand. Like I'm just saying that if we start with an axiom, right, and then your inferences are justified on the basis of those of coherence with those axioms, that's what I take rationality to be, right? And so in the instance of me, I take inference rules like modus ponens, double negation, conjunction elimination. I take those types of inferences to be non-inferentially arrived at, right? And I don't know anybody who wouldn't take those, because I couldn't argue for them on the basis of those types of inferences, right? If I were to do that, that would argue in a circle, right? So I take them as the outset, as the skeletal structure of what rationality is, and then I operate with rationality within that confinement.
Well, I would agree with you that I don't think anyone has been successful in attempting to come up with inferential grounds for those. But my philosophy isn't that rationality is the search for inferential grounds. I don't think it's a problem for my epistemology. But if one's epistemology
I'm not saying rationality is the search for, right? I'm saying my idea of what rationality is, the character of rationality, is to be in accord with these set of inference rules, right? That's what I take rationality to be. That's my claim. I'm not saying it's rational to search for that or not rational to search for that, although I think, given agency, you're going to have to be beholden to some of those types of norms, and maybe I can give an argument to that, but I'm not really interested in getting into that, right? Because that's sort of irrelevant. But to the point is just that this is what I'm taking rationality to be, right? And it doesn't follow from the fact that it's irrational to have those beliefs, right? That it's not rational, right? It's not within the rules of inference, or I'm not providing inferences to those beliefs. It doesn't follow from that fact that I have a self-defeating worldview, right? It just follows from that's not a rational belief, right?
I mean, maybe we just disagree here. But if your system is defining rationality, that is, the conception of being rational is to comport to those principles of reason, is to have an inferential basis for the belief given these certain axioms, but you can't give any basis for the axioms. The axioms themselves don't provide any basis. You just choose those because.
Well,
then,
I don't.
yes,
But what I'm saying, I rejected that they're chosen, right?
Okay, well, that seems to be that maybe the terminology you disagree with. Holding that those is in fact your axiom, or your starting point, right? Holding to that, having that belief, the occurrence of that belief, is irrational. And since all of your beliefs are inferentially based on those axioms, then yes, absolutely, your system implodes.
I mean, I don't
Well,
understand.
wouldn't you want to make a distinction between what's irrational and irrational there? Like his beliefs would stem from an irrational basis, but I'm not sure how it follows that it's irrational in the sense that, you know, given the criteria he's setting out for what counts as irrational, you know, resulting in incoherence or other sorts of consequences. I'm not sure how it would follow from that holding to those axioms and not having a justification, presumably, for those axioms would be irrational as opposed to irrational.
Well, I'm taking as a given here that non-truth functional statements, belief in non-truth functional statements, ideas, etc., are just in fact irrational. So to believe in something that is irrational just is irrational, because belief in meaningless utterances is irrational.
How is what he's saying is not truth functional though? It's not an imperative or an interjection, I take it. It's some sort of proposition.
I think that it is truth functional, but I don't think that his system can account for its truth functionality. I think given his system, it isn't truth functional.
I guess I'm not following. Maybe you could spell that out?
Yeah, if one has a categorical reason, like, so for example, I'm a Christian theist. I believe that there is a categorical normativity to principles of reason provided by the commands of God, which ground that categorical normativity. That means that my decision or the occurrence of the belief, it doesn't really matter, in beliefs which are inferred from those reasons or which comport to those reasons are in fact rational. But if one's system is simply that these axioms are arbitrary, that they are by caprice, that they are not
Well,
categorically
I don't know if he said that
normative.
they were arbitrary. I think he was just, I'm not sure if he made a comment on that. So you might want to clarify that before you make that chart.
Well, yeah, I think that I am. I mean, Josh can correct me, but I think that I am. I have sufficient reason to believe that it is arbitrary. Arbitrary for all uses of the word that's relevant to this conversation, anyways. We're talking about having rational beliefs. So arbitrary just means anytime that you have a belief which accrues because of a reason other than one that's sufficient for having that belief.
Well, I guess I'm interpreting that as meaning having a belief that isn't related to what conduces to the truth in some fashion. Or is that mistaken?
I would. I mean, that belief might be arbitrary, but the arbitrariness of a belief isn't its lack of correspondence or lack of conduciveness to truth. It has to do with the reason why the belief is held. It has to do with justification,
Yeah, that's
right?
what I was saying. That's what I was saying, which is that when it comes to the belief for factors that are irrelevant insofar as truth conduciveness is concerned. So like
I missed that. The reason for the belief. Yes, that's accurate.
Like a historical contingency or where one grows up or other sorts of things.
Subjectivism is the objection, basically.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he was claiming that the beliefs he has of that sort.
Sorry,
But I mean, either way, I guess I'm still not quite following what the argument is. I mean, he's starting from
What is
some
that
set.
noise?
I think that might be my fan. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, it's not doing it anymore, so.
I moved it away. I guess I'm just not quite following what the problem is precisely. I mean, it just seems like either some type of standard coherentist or maybe foundationalist. I mean, depending on how you want to characterize justification in relation to basicality. Which is just simply that you start with some stock of beliefs, and the one comes some stock of basic beliefs, and other beliefs are rational insofar as they're connected to the stock of basic beliefs by some process involving inference and other sorts of rules. And that's compatible with, say, one coming to later on change or alter what the stock of basic beliefs are. I mean, at least that's how I think most modest foundationalists think of it. They think basicality isn't the same thing as infallibility. Basic beliefs can be defeasible.
Can you clarify exactly what you didn't understand about the argument?
Well, I guess I'm not sure what the argument is, so if you could maybe lay that out, then that might be the best way to
Yeah,
proceed.
I'm not sure I can do that any clearer than I already have, to be honest. I'm not a.
Well, I mean, you said something about it not being truth functional, which sounded surprising.
Yeah, I mean, so the reason I don't, I think that's the argument is that given that one's conception of rationality, again, in the sense that is relevant to the project of epistemology, right? If one is defining.
Sorry, I lost audio for since you began speaking. So if you can maybe start over, if that's all right.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, the charge is not brute that it's non-truth functional. The charge is that given that one's system relies on an irrational account, then all of the beliefs just implode given that account. Namely, if you have a system that defines rationality as having beliefs which are inferentially gained or based upon certain axioms, but those axioms themselves are based on an irrational choice or an irrational event of some sort or whatever, then the whole
well,
system
I mean, they're not based
irrational.
upon other inferences, but I mean, I thought the whole point is that one distinguishes what's irrational from what's irrational, right? I mean, one isn't claiming that those axioms contradict each other, are we? Or that the inferences contradict the axioms, or that the axioms themselves are inconsistent with whatever set of inference rules one has taken to be basic, like modus ponens or whatnot. If that was the case, then you could charge that it's being irrational. Not sure how you can make the identification with irrationality and irrationality. That seems like a much more surprising identification to make.
Yeah, I don't understand how my clarification there isn't getting through. The irrationality of something releases it from truth functionality, and if it's not truth functional, it's not meaningful, and if it's not meaningful, there's no reason to suspect that it is a sufficient reason for any belief.
Factional to it being non-truth functional. I mean, are you just saying it's not a truth-apt proposition in the case where it's on an irrational basis, and if so, what's the argument for that?
Because the basis for the beliefs is found in the axioms, and the axioms are taken on irrational grounds. So that means the entire belief set stands or falls with whether or not that irrational ground is sufficient.
Did you understand my question?
Yeah, I believe I answered it. You were looking for the reason why irrationality entails
But
irrationality.
don't you think that truth aptitude is a property of propositions, right? And so, insofar as if you believe what I uttered was a proposition, then it follows that you believe that what I said was truth apt. So it seems like you're just contradicting that view, unless you believe that not all propositions are truth apt or something like that.
No, I think what you're saying is perfectly truth apt. The reason I can believe that, the reason it's rational for me to believe that, is because I have an epistemology which isn't incoherent like yours. But with your epistemology, because you base everything. Yeah, I mean that's what I was explaining before. Is from irrationality, basically irrationality comes. There's attributing rational beliefs from something that is not, which occur on grounds of something that is not, is irrational.
I don't see how that follows, right? Just because, are you arguing that the norms I posit for being the foundation of rationality are inconsistent with themselves, which would be, on my definition, irrational? I mean, I don't understand what you're arguing, because I never made the claim, right? My epistemology doesn't have the axiom that you seem to think that my epistemology does, which is that if something is irrational, it's irrational, right? So that's not part of that's not an axiom that I hold. And so to point out that the foundation is irrational is not to show an incoherence with my axioms.
Your belief in the axioms, is that inferred from them?
No,
Okay, there you go.
I don't understand.
No, but I mean that gets back to this charge of like I'm not sure. Like I mean, typically we like in the literature or wherever, I don't know, we distinguish between what's irrational, something that isn't arrived at, say by some rational process or whatever, like some set of inference rules or whatever, versus what's irrational, where presumably one would follow an invalid inference rule or one would land up in a contradiction or other sorts of factors. And you don't seem to be claiming that what Josh is doing is following an invalid inference rule because he's not using an inference rule. If you're not using an inference rule, it can't be valid or invalid. I'm not sure if you've said that his axioms contradict each other in any fashion, at least not over and above this charge that in virtue of it being irrational, it's irrational. I'm not sure like how that holds precisely. So I think that's sort of what Josh is getting at when he's saying that just showing that all of my beliefs, let's say, stem from some set of basic beliefs, where those basic beliefs, in virtue of being basic, are not themselves based inferentially upon other beliefs, that itself means that his whole belief set is in some sense irrational, as opposed to stemming from something that's irrational.
Yeah, but what I'm pointing out is that to use your words there, the concept of something stemming from something irrational is irrational.
Why is that the case, though?
Because it's a categorical error to expect rationality from non-rationality.
I mean, how is that?
But that's a different argument, though, isn't it? That sounds like something like an argument from reason. But I mean that's because I mean with the argument from reason, it's talking about like how non-rational processes, like how the cause-effect relation isn't the same as the ground-consequent relation, like in Lewis's argument. But you didn't seem to be giving that argument. You seem to be giving an argument that generalized against almost any standard account of foundationalism, the classical or modest foundationalism, right, where one arrives at some set of beliefs which are not themselves justified by other beliefs, by some inferential process. I'm not sure like how that wouldn't be just a subject to the type of argument you seem to be making here.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think most classical foundationalists hold to that. Like, for example, if you look at Descartes, intuitions are taken to be innate, but they're not taken to be sourced, at least for their justification or their rationality on things which are not themselves rational. It is precisely the nature of the mind as a rational entity, as an entity which is finds for its ontology a relationship to principles of reason, for which one is allowed to think that his intuitions are, in fact, rational. The others are obviously
contradicting what Josh is saying, because I mean, with Descartes, he's saying that he has certain clear and distinct ideas that he can sort of immediately see, like he can clearly and distinctively perceive, like the self-evident truth of something that 2 + 2 = 4, or that I exist, or so on and so forth. Is that in contradiction? I mean, even leaving aside this debate about classical foundationalism and other sorts of foundationalism, I'm not sure how that in and of itself is in contradiction with this view that one set of beliefs terminates in beliefs which are not themselves given a justification for in terms of, being connected via inference to other beliefs.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure. I mean, I didn't bring up the distinction between moderate and stronger versions of foundationalism, but my issue is that if one is supporting one's belief system on some state of affairs that is not itself related in a way to rationality that is sufficient to bring about rational beliefs, then there's no reason to consider that belief rational. It fails on its own, or it compromises its own system, because the system itself posits that we ought to have beliefs which comport to these axioms and which
So
are
then
justified.
then you would go into an infinite regress, wouldn't you? Where you would always have to have a reason. You could never get to basicality, surely, because
No,
as
no,
soon
no.
as you get to basicality, that would be irrational.
That's why I brought up Descartes, right? Because Descartes' light of nature was the concept that certain beliefs, due to their content, could be self-evident. But Joss explicitly denied that. He said, I don't have an account for these beliefs in axioms, right? So that is problematic.
But to have an account for something is to have a reason for it, yeah?
But not necessarily outside itself.
So give me an example of something that is accounted for just by virtue of the content of the thing.
So I would say that I think that God's revelation is something which need not appeal to an external source in order for you to have sufficient justification in believing its content.
So any other examples which don't involve God?
No, I don't think so. Not that I know of. I'm not
So
sure that it's
basically,
possible.
yeah.
I have a suspicion that it's not possible to have inherent justification of that sort outside of God's revelation.
And that was Descartes' view.
Well, Descartes' view was and again, this is the key distinction between coherentism and foundationalism, why I reject foundationalism. Descartes' idea was that all beliefs could be reduced to those which were intuitions and those which could be deduced from intuitions. There were no other types of beliefs. I do not believe that. I think that there are beliefs that are indispensable. I would never say that we can exhaustively classify all beliefs as basic beliefs and inferential beliefs based upon those basic beliefs. I think that's silly.
So are there any indispensable beliefs in order to ground rationality? Do you think there's indispensable beliefs for rationality?
Yeah, I would say I think that Christian theism is indispensable.
But the reliability of your memory isn't indispensable to that.
Well, I would say that Christian theism provides my memory, right? Like I'm not assuming a system abstracted from my personal affairs. The worldview that I'm assuming, the worldview that I'm talking about here assumes my personal relationship to it, right?
Yeah, so it seems to me all you're saying basically is that every attempt to have basic beliefs would fall to the same irrationality as Joss's would, because it's not founded on Christianity.
Well, I don't make I don't use the distinction between basic and non-basic beliefs. But yeah, I mean that is my system, right? I think that that's the only coherent system, is to say that with respect to truth, truth is that which comports to God's mind, and to say with respect to justification, one is rational for believing something so insofar as it comports to God's revelation.
But why think God exists?
That's content of the revelation, right?
Yeah, but that's just to argue in a circle, yeah?
It depends on what you mean by that. If you mean begging the question, no, I didn't use a premise as a conclusion. If you mean I'm being self-consistent or self-referentially consistent, then yes, I am being quote-unquote circular.
Yeah, so there's no way out of that circle.
I mean, that's a virtue. I take it as a virtue that epistemologies are self-consistent. If someone is
What he's getting at
self-referentially...
is that somebody who isn't already within that circle will have no reason to enter it, including the belief that that is the only coherent worldview, is I think what Matt is getting at, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But what is the basis of that belief? does that come from this worldview, or is that found outside it? If outside it, it's irrelevant.
Well, irrelevant according to whom?
Exactly, yeah. I mean,
No, but
in other
that
words,
sort of gets that's what you're saying, right? I mean, if it's irrelevant according to you, why would that matter to somebody who isn't a Christian?
I don't see how that follows. The lack of consistency in non-Christian belief systems in no way affects the relevance or significance of the truth of the Christian theistic system. I don't see how that's related there.
But there wouldn't
Can you
even
repeat
be
that?
there wouldn't even be the same kind of I mean, like I referenced earlier, like a Muslim could argue the same way, a Jew could argue the same way. Anyone who
No,
believes
I
in,
think he would deny that they could
yeah,
argue
yeah,
the
yeah,
same
yeah,
way.
of course he would, because he's a Christian. But the Muslim could be putting forward, if we had a Muslim in here and a Jew in here, they could be saying that they have the same consistent uh, consistent way of beliefs, and that's found in Allah, or that's found in Yahweh, but it's not found in Christianity, which is a false religion.
I mean, yeah, I don't understand how that's not just a fallacious appeal to controversy. I mean, everything is controversial. If you look hard enough, people have disagreed about everything. But the fact that people disagree about something, the fact that people may even use the same form of arguments for contradictories, does not entail that there's no truth of the matter, and neither does it entail that one of them can't be correct about the matter.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. But the thing is, though, you can't. That you're not giving us a reason to think that that truth can only be found in Christianity and not in Islam or Judaism or any other theistic system.
But what I'm pointing out is if that claim is based on the system that I just disproved, then it's baseless. It's just a capricious assertion.
It's not. I mean, the Muslim could be using the same kind of precept, kind of God's revelation is the only God's revelation is the only thing that can give us a coherent way of talking about our beliefs and basing and grounding our beliefs. So that's a non-Christian grounding for beliefs that's basically arguing the exact same way, and there needs to be some sort of way to differentiate between these same theisms that are mutually exclusively contradictory to each other. And you don't get a free pass for Christianity just because you're a Christian and asserting your own God gets you there. And I don't see how
nobody said that, though.
So how are you going to differentiate between these other gods who would be putting forward the kind of self-same argument?
Okay, let me recap real quick, because I'll turn into a broken record if I keep having to address this. The argument that there is use of an appeal to revelation by many different religious groups is just a fallacy of appeal to controversy. Yes, many people disagree about many things. Often, maybe more often than not, people use the same form of arguments for conclusions that are contradictory. But just because we can reach invalid conclusions through valid arguments does not mean that we should throw away trying to be logical in our analysis and our argumentation. The second point was Christians don't get a free pass for being Christian. Well, nobody has argued, and nobody's arguing, at least in the Reformed apologetics camp that I'm a part of, that because I have a Bible or because Christian theism is true, therefore it's true, or therefore you should convert. Nobody's arguing that. That's just not the argument. The argument is that disbelief invokes the very concept disbelieved, and so disbelief is irrational. All points of view outside of Christianity are irrational, right? Because they don't meet the standard of rationality. Now, as far as distinguishing Christianity from different religions, I'm a little bit incredulous, because theologians with 10 times my brilliance have done that for centuries they've done a really good job, and I couldn't even begin to point out all the differences. I could point out three. I could say that none of the gods outside of Christianity are a se, are personal in the same way that the Christian God condescends, and none of the gods are gracious in the way that the Christian gods are gracious. You will not find those three things together in any other god.
You realize
I
you've
have
thrown
to, do you mind if I interrupt briefly? Because I don't have long to speak, so I want to make this point before I have to get busy doing what else I'm going to do, but I'll listen to your response, Jimmy. The point I want to make is that now, what I'm saying is irrationality is inconsistency. That is to say, there's some tension between some beliefs within this axiom set, right? There is, in fact, a tension between these beliefs. That's what it means for a belief to be inconsistent, right? There's like a contradiction somewhere in my belief set. That's what I take it to be. And so when you say that my belief is irrational, you're saying it's inconsistent with those beliefs for it to be irrational, right? But I didn't concede that because I never made the claim, right, that my belief is that irrational beliefs are inconsistent with the norms of rationality, right? I never made that claim. So you charging that, right, and claiming that that's true is not an argument. So the goal for you is to substantiate the claim that if your norms of rationality are themselves irrational, that's inconsistent with your norms of rationality. So a couple things you need to do this. You need to know all my norms of rationality, or at least one of my norms of rationality with which it being irrational is inconsistent, and you haven't done that. So those are the sufficient conditions. That's what you need to do.
Okay, well, I think the use of the word need there is interesting, but as far as showing that entailed in an irrationally based philosophy is irrational beliefs, and that means irrationality. That to me is very simple. I think that I've already done it a few times, but my best
I think you're begging the question there consistently. Josh is distinguishing between irrationality and irrationality. The response just can't consist of saying that to be irrational is the same as being irrational.
No, I get what he's saying. I think I get what he's saying, that, you know, if you're starting from a position of properly basic beliefs or basic beliefs, and you're basically saying that those aren't grounded in reasons, you don't have reasons for those, they're irrational, then nothing that follows from them can be rational. I think that's what he's arguing. I don't see how it follows, but I think that's what he's arguing.
Well, but again, the distinction is between irrationality and irrationality. Josh just defined, or he clarified what he meant by irrationality as some type of inconsistency or contradiction, say, within the axioms, or between beliefs that are inferred from the axioms and the axioms themselves, or between beliefs that are inferred from the axioms and other beliefs that are inferred from other axioms or whatnot, right? That's what he's counting as being irrational, some type of some sort of incoherence or contradiction or what have you. But that's very different from just saying that my beliefs terminate in some set of beliefs which are not themselves founded on the basis of inference from other beliefs. I'm not sure how that, in and of itself, results in a contradiction, or at least I think an argument or an extended argument of some sort would have to be given for that. Not just merely claiming that irrational and irrational are one and the same.
I don't think that was my argument. I think it's a straw man. The argument is not that irrationality and irrationality are the same. The argument is that irrationality does not protect or entail rational results. It is accidental to rational beliefs. And so there's, in other words, one of your norms, if your system includes that you believe these axioms, and you have no justification for them, you have an irrational source for these axioms, then any belief is on the table because irrationality can provide for any belief. Oh, my stomach is full. I think I'll believe that these axioms are false. Oh, I have an itch in my ear. I think I'll believe that I don't exist. That's, yeah, well, that's exactly irrationality, because irrationality doesn't protect you from irrationality. This is the same mistake that people trying to defend against Plantinga's argument against naturalism make. They always strawman Plantinga, thinking that he is arguing that irrationality results from evolution, but that's not the argument. The argument is that evolution is not a reliable source for rational beliefs, and neither is any kind of irrationality.
I mean,
Well, I
I
mean,
didn't
we
make
want to
that. I didn't make.
distinguish.
Hold
Sorry,
on.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I didn't make that claim, right? So I don't see how it's showing an inconsistency in my worldview if I didn't make that claim, right? I don't think rocks are rational. I think rocks are non-rational, right? I don't think rocks are irrational, right? Nonetheless, I don't think rocks are inconsistent, right? So you'd have, so in your view, right, if the irrational right, somehow doesn't do any favors to rationality, that's fine. I don't see where I contested that, right? I agree that it's not the case that if something is irrational, then it's not rational, right? Like I don't understand how that's supposed to be an argument against my belief. I agree.
Because you take irrationality as being sufficient for having some beliefs, yes?
No.
Then why do you have some beliefs which are self-admittedly based on irrationality?
I don't think that it's a sufficient condition, right? Just because it happens to be a property of some beliefs, I don't think it's a sufficient condition for those beliefs.
Oh, okay. Then maybe I wasn't clear with my question before, but that's exactly when I was asking you earlier about when I was asking you whether or not you had an inferential basis to provide for the claim that rationality is the project that seeks inferential bases, and you said that you didn't have an account for that belief. That's exactly what I was asking for. I was asking for a sufficient reason why one should believe that.
I just said I don't have a reason for someone to believe that that's the project of rationality, right, is to be consistent with these epistemic norms. I conceded that I don't have a reason that would motivate someone to be consistent with those, right? For instance,
is the definition of arbitrariness as relevant to this.
I mean, I don't see how that's arbitrary.
Because you're believing something without sufficient reason to believe it. And if you believe that, and if that's the basis of your system, namely a belief you have for no sufficient reason provided, then all of your beliefs fall down to this one belief of, I believe this for no reason that I can provide.
Well, I think he's just saying that he couldn't provide an argument to somebody that, say, rejected the project of giving arguments or something. In the same way, presumably you couldn't give someone a reason to believe in the law of non-contradiction if they rejected it. What would your argument consist of? That they're being inconsistent or something? They don't care. But that, I mean, the question of arbitrariness itself is sort of interesting because, I mean, what counts as arbitrary is presumably going to depend on what you think does or does not conduce to the truth, which, again, is going to come down to a question of epistemic norms. So when you're charging Josh with having arbitrary beliefs in that fashion, I'm not sure if that's sound, because to count as arbitrary is presumably with respect to some set of norms, perhaps, in fact, even the norms that he himself adheres to.
Okay, given that we are allowed to have beliefs without sufficient reason for them, why should I not believe that Josh's system is false?
Well, that depends on how he's setting it out. I mean, if he's some type of anti-foundationalist, he might be epistemically permissive in that way, in the way Plantinga's original version of Reformed epistemology was. You could just go ahead and believe that in a basic way. That's compatible with that belief being defeated later on, or whatever. Not sure if that would be a problem.
What I'm pointing out is that the basis for the one is simultaneously the basis for the other. irrationality provides for the axioms as much as it provides for the negation of the axioms. And that
I mean,
which
but
entails...
is that a problem though? Because we're talking about rationality here. We're not talking about theories of truth or what counts as being true or whatnot. Presumably, one can have a rational belief while not having knowledge, right? Or one can have a rational belief in something that's false. I thought we were talking about rationality, not what's known.
Yeah, no, you missed that part. The epistemology was where this all came from. But at the same time, I don't see how that's provided at all. I take it as a given. All rational beliefs are beliefs about the truth. It's impossible to have a rational belief to falsity. I'd say that's an oxymoron.
So you don't think somebody could rationally believe something that's false, like they follow like the inference rules or whatever, but they end up having a false belief? You think that? Sorry.
I would. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I would tend to take a contextualist understanding of standards for what counts as sufficient reasons for things. So, for example, in an empiric context, you need more than just being internally coherent to have rational beliefs, to have beliefs that are about the truth. But when we're talking about the most basic or the most fundamental, or whatever word you want to use, in a way that doesn't mean basic in the way that foundationalists mean it, if you want to talk about our most ultimate beliefs, then we cannot use empirical means to analyze and try to persuade each other about those, because they're not falsifiable, for example. And they have other properties that make them immune to...
Well, I mean, I imagine that's contestable, but I suppose you could do with that.
Okay, yeah, but my point is, in Josh's case, yeah, I guess I'm just making myself a broken record here, but it's a very simple argument. If I posit that brain disease, is a good source of my belief system, that I believe my belief system, given the incurments of brain disease, nobody would take that seriously. And the reason being is that brain disease causes one to have false beliefs. And even if it didn't, nobody would take it seriously, because it doesn't have anything to do with providing true beliefs, right? What you're talking about is truth conduciveness.
But you're talking about the causal basis of your beliefs, right? When Josh was talking about his beliefs terminating in something that's irrational, all he was getting at is he was talking about, with respect to the ground-consequent relation, there are certain sorts of beliefs that are not themselves going to be based by some means of inference on other beliefs, right? That's compatible with any number of views as to what is the cause of those beliefs in the first place. And I imagine that he or other foundationalists could agree that there are certain sorts of causal processes that presumably would have some tension on this view that one's beliefs that are, say, generated are in fact rational. But presumably there are also others that don't have that tension. That would be a separate question.
I just want to clarify that I'm a coherentist, right? So I just am adopting the basic belief language for the sake of argument, because I think it still has use in the coherentist epistemology. I want to make that clear.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I think I understood you weren't a foundationalist. No. So I was asking a more general problem. What I would ask now is, well, what system of epistemology considers causes of belief outside of justification? I've never heard of that. I've heard of externalistic justifications. I've never heard of a system that talks about causes that have absolutely nothing to do with our belief set about originality and causality being connected to justification.
I'm not sure if I said anything that strong, or Josh said anything that strong. I think when Josh was talking about irrationality, I mean, I understood him just to be referring to that there are beliefs that one has that aren't irrational in the sense that they violate the norms of rationality, but they're not rational in the sense that they follow from some set of inferences according to the norms of rationality from other beliefs, right? That's a distinct question from asking then, of the basic beliefs one does in fact have, what are the causes, in this case, presumably cause in the non-rational sense of cause, in the what Lewis calls the cause-effect relation as opposed to the ground-consequent relation of those beliefs, right? So someone like Plantinga would say, well, the causes of your beliefs there are because, you know, God endowed you with cognitive faculties that follow some sort of design plan, et cetera, et cetera. Some type of reliabilist like Goldman might appeal to an evolutionary account. I mean, there's going to be all kinds of accounts as to how one's beliefs are generated in that fashion. And I'm taking that whole debate to be distinct from this question as to whether or not one's beliefs do terminate in, say, this set of beliefs that are not themselves irrational insofar as contradicting the norms of rationality, nor are they themselves inferred on the basis of other beliefs.
Yeah, I guess I would tend to disagree with that. I think the distinction is not being made between debating the principles of either cause or justification for a given epistemology versus debating epistemologies. Since the epistemology as a whole is the very thing in question, my question about a sufficient reason for Josh's belief, or the word he used was inferential basis, was not exclusive to causes, neither does it demand a cause. But I simply used what Josh gave me, and that was the admission that A, he doesn't have an account, not explicitly at least, as to why, as to an inferential basis for these axioms, and B, the source of those beliefs, we use the word the occurrence of those beliefs is irrational. The problem being then, well, if irrationality is a principle that your philosophy accepts, it concedes irrational beliefs as acceptable, then one can believe, and by irrational beliefs, I don't mean that the belief themselves is a content irrational. I'm saying that the belief has behind it a reason or cause which is irrational, right? If one system allows for that sort of belief, then it allows for its contradiction. That is a self-referential error, and any such system then is, by its own standards, meaningless. It's not intelligible. All that is just to say, you can debate cause and justification separately. There's no need to. In fact, it's probably a poor idea if epistemologies as a whole is in question.
Sorry, I was having audio issues. Could you? I didn't hear your last statement from like 30 seconds ago. Could you repeat?
Yeah, no problem. I said that all of that is just. I basically summed it up. I said all that is just to say, while you can debate the concept of causality apart from justification or warrant or some other placeholder for the sufficient normative causes for a belief, it's probably unwise to do so. It's not conducive to a debate about epistemologies as a whole.
I guess I'm not quite following there, but I think the point where your argument went a little fast for me was where you were, like you talked about, on the one hand, you were saying something about how Josh's view allows for certain irrational, here again, irrational, meaning that it's not based on other beliefs connected via inference rules or whatever. He allows those kinds of beliefs to be acceptable. And then from that, you were saying something about how if that process isn't, by which one acquires irrational beliefs, is not itself rational. And again, I'm understanding that to be meaning something like connected via inference rules or whatever, then something about self-reference, and then I didn't really catch the rest of that. So maybe if you could explain that step of the argument.
Yeah. The argument is just that Josh has a principle which allows both for the affirmation and negation of his entire system. So long as he affirms that principle, his system is self-referentially incoherent, because any position which holds that its affirmation or negation is acceptable is a meaningless statement, right? It's just a case of the liar's paradox in epistemological format.
I guess I'm not quite following it. Are you just saying there's something about like because I'm not sure if like Josh is saying anything like that. I mean, that's strong. But are you saying that having an epistemically permissive epistemology, like reformed epistemology or phenomenal conservatism or what have you, that those are somehow self-defeating because one could, like take phenomenal conservatism for example, right? Someone like Hume would say we're rational in holding a belief insofar as we have an undefeated prima facie seeming that the belief is true. So I'm rational in having my belief that P, if P seems to me to be true, and I encounter no defeaters for P. Are you saying that because that view allows, let's say, someone else to instead have the seeming that not P instead is true, that view is contradictory or inconsistent?
It's that view allows for its own negation that makes it irrational. Yes, it makes it inconsistent.
What do you mean by it allows for its own negation?
So something like reformed epistemology is sort of unique because it appeals to God's creative acts. But
let's just use the example of phenomenal conservatism. Like I said, I don't know if I've defined it as concisely
sure.
as I'd like to, but just the view that a belief is rational to the extent that if it seems to one that P and one encounters no defeaters for P.
Yeah, I would just say they look at history for the counters to P, and in this case, P is the system itself, phenomenal conservatism.
Well, I mean, I don't think Hume would agree with that because he doesn't think that views outside of phenomenal conservatism are consistent. But I mean, even independent of that, even if phenomenal conservatism allows what someone else could say be rational in disbelieving in phenomenal conservatism, what does that have to do with somebody who instead does seem to them that phenomenal conservatism is true, and it is the case that they encounter no defeatist for it? It's one thing to say that we're not talking about what's quote rational. I don't know if I would say in general. I'm not sure if that's the right word to say here, but I think you would get this charge of irrationality if you could somehow show that this one and the same person would somehow be compelled to or would have to believe both P and not P. I think the most you've shown is that they can believe P and they can believe not P, but that's distinct from saying that they have to believe both P and not P.
Not if not if the goal of epistemology is to have a coherent concept of knowledge, which precludes the idea that the system itself can be contradictory. If you're saying I have this system, the system
No. Not that it can be contradictory. There's a distinction between saying possibly P or possibly not P from possibly P or not P, right? It could seem to somebody that P, or it could seem to somebody that not P, but that's distinct from saying it could seem to them that P or not P, or that they in fact have to believe P or not P.
But he's talking about the system. He's talking about the system, not individuals believing in the system.
No, I'm saying even with respect to the system itself, right? For one individual.
Oh, that's where I would. Yeah, I guess that's where we differ. I guess that's where we differ. According to Josh's system, he takes as a principle, or he takes as an idea, something that is in fact necessary to his system at this point, irrational beliefs. That is beliefs for which he cannot give a sufficient reason why he has them, right? Internalist or externalist, doesn't matter.
Well, I don't know if he would say externalist. I mean, that's.
But there's a
I thought
reason
we were
for that as well. Like, it's not like you can't charge the foundationalist or someone in that position with arbitrarily choosing that belief. The reason why they hold that view is because the very thing they're trying to ground is reasoning, and you can't appeal to reasoning in order to ground your reasoning.
Okay, I would accept that as progress to the conversation, but Joss explicitly said that he doesn't have an account for those beliefs, probably because there's very easy follow-up objections to the kind of response you just gave, Matt.
Like what?
Like that indubitability or indispensability are not in and of themselves sufficient properties of an epistemological starting point.
Why not?
Because maybe we're just indispensably irrational.
You don't think indubitability works either?
No.
Is this just some kind of Stroudian point? Like Stroud's argument against transcendental arguments?
No, I actually disagree with Stroud. No, what I would say is that the only example of all of the preconditions, of all the properties which need to be set there in motion as preconditions of our belief set, in order for us to have any kind of progress at all in regards to epistemology, is the revelation of God. And I know you're coming to the conversation late here, Hypatia, but I'm talking about
Hypatia.
Christian. Hypatia. I'm talking about the Christian God.
Yeah, arbitrarily so.
Well, I don't think he would view it that way, but I mean, even before we get into that.
He's not given any reason to prefer the God of Christianity over any other God. So if he's not given any reason for doing it, it seems as if he's just going with his own preference, because that's the God he happens to believe in, and I don't know how that wouldn't be. I don't know how that wouldn't fit with the.
Well, maybe there's some argument from the
arbitrary.
Trinity or something. I mean, Van Til uses some argument from the Trinity or something, but I don't quite understand it. But I don't know. I'm just saying, even before we get into those tendentious waters, I'm just trying to get a grip on this idea that you don't think indubitability or indispensability themselves could be grounds for finding something to be basic. Or rather, if one holds those beliefs at all, that one is going to hold them in a basic way.
This is what I would say about it. I would say that where you have indispensability, the metaphysical grounding to be found in non-Christian worldviews is insufficient. And where you have metaphysical points for grounding in worldviews outside of Christianity, you don't have indispensability.
Well, maybe then maybe I guess we do need to get into those tendentious waters. So maybe you could explain what it is about Christianity that's adding over and above indispensability and indubitability to allow one to say form in a basic way that, I don't know, 2 + 2 = 4, or I have hands, or other sorts of beliefs of that kind.
Sure. So as I stated before, my position, which can be called revelational epistemology, and which is, as far as I'm concerned, identical to Scott Oliphant's view and Van Til's, and to a lesser degree John Frame and Bahnsen and Butler and others. But revelational epistemology is simply the idea that God and his creation are the exhaustive classes of metaphysic. There's no such thing that's not God or creation. All things are one of those two classes of being. Everything that is in creation is the revelation of God. God, in choosing to freely create the world, descends or stoops to it. He accommodates himself to it in a way to communicate his being and the character of his being to the creatures in it. And I would say the revelation of God consists of the implanted knowledge of God, which is innate to our being. What it means to be human is to have an awareness of God's being. There is a general category of revelation, which is just, you could use the word that things have a hallmark of God's divinity plaqued on them, such that in the same way that you couldn't have a square without four sides, so you couldn't have anything in creation without God's providence causing it to be that way, ever present. And then the last category of God's revelation is the Christian scriptures, which on top of giving a general overview of God's character, provide statements about the Christ, statements about Jesus that are necessary for people's salvation.
Okay, so
I
you have
apologize, that's a
innate
lot of...
knowledge, general revelation, and scripture, if I have that correct.
All
Is that
of
correct?
Yes.
all
Yeah,
of which are equally found in other religions.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, in Islam you have divine revelation from Islam, on that there. You have scriptures in Islam. You have innate knowledge of God in Islam. In Judaism and Christianity is.
Can I respond to that real quick? That's very easy to. These are only 3 problems out of like 100 that have been given. I mean, without even looking at the historical problems with Islam. But number one, Islam doesn't believe in a triune God. So how they intend to ground personality, I have no idea. Islam believes in a God whose election is arbitrary. So how he meets his own standards of justice, I have no idea. And Islam also posits that the law of God, that is his revelation, a created thing, exists eternally beside him. So Muhammad accidentally committed some type of Platonism, which denies the aseity of God, which means that from the outset their theology is incoherent, because any theology which doesn't
What
have
was the
aseity...
first 2 that you mentioned? Because I mean, the third issue is one that's not universal.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you mean by Islam. I wasn't counting liberal Mohammedans here, but
no, I mean not even liberal ones. I mean the view as to whether or not the Quran is created or uncreated is not something that even all Sunni Muslims hold to, even among classical theologians. And it's certainly one that most Shiite Muslims reject. So I mean, what you're pointing to is not somehow some specific problem for Islam simpliciter. And even there, I'm not quite sure if it contradicts aseity any more so than emanationist views would contradict aseity.
I would say emanationist views do contradict aseity.
Yeah, but not all people who hold to the Christian worldview hold to aseity.
Yes, but neither do I condemn Christians who do so. I think that behavior is wrong, but I don't think that just because it's wrong, you're not a Christian.
But I was just curious about the first 2 you had mentioned before, the thing about the Quran being
the first one had to
eternal.
do with the Trinity.
Grounding personality without the Trinity.
How would that contradict personality, though, if God wasn't triune?
Because personality, there's no concept of personality without intersubjective relationships. There's no such thing as psychology without sociology, basically.
How would that follow?
You mean, why is that the case?
I mean, are you saying that for one to have a mind, other minds need to exist?
Sorry, I missed that. For one to have a what?
Are you saying that for one to have a mind, there need to be other minds? Or are you saying something distinct from that?
Oh, I don't think that having a mind is the definition of personality. Right? Like I would say that the only from the Christian perspective, there's only two types of personality. There's the absolute personality of the Godhead, which is triune, and then there's the personality instantiated by the many human beings throughout history, which have personality in respect to the fact that they have the imago Dei. That is their personality.
And it's certainly one that most Shiite Muslims reject. So I mean, what
Yeah,
you're pointing to is not somehow some specific problem for Islam's implicator. And even there, I'm not quite sure if it contradicts aseity any more so than emanationist views would contradict aseity.
I would say emanationist views do contradict aseity.
yeah, but not all people who hold to the Christian worldview hold to aseity.
Yes, but neither do I, neither do I condemn Christians who do so. I think that behavior is wrong, but I don't think that just because it's wrong, you're not a Christian.
But
So it's
I was
not
just
a-
curious about the first two you had mentioned before the thing about the Quran being
Oh, the first
eternal
one had to
and
do
such.
with the Trinity.
grounding personality without the Trinity.
How would that contradict personality, though, if God wasn't triune?
Because personality, there's no concept of personality without intersubjective relationships. There's no such thing as psychology without sociology, basically.
How would that follow?
You mean, why is that the case?
I mean, are you saying that for one to have a mind, other minds need to exist?
Sorry, I missed that. For
Are you
one to
saying
have
something?
a what?
Are you saying that for one to have a mind, there need to be other minds? Or are you saying something distinct from that?
Oh, I don't think that having a mind is the definition of personality, right? Like I would say that the only from the Christian perspective, there's only two types of personality. There's the absolute personality of the Godhead, which is triune, and then there's the personality instantiated by the many human beings throughout history, which have personality in respect to the fact that they have the imago Dei. That is their personality.
Well,
The imago Dei.
what I'm trying to understand is what you mean by that personality. Well, first maybe you could clarify what you mean by personality in the divine case, in any case.
Intersubjective.
No, but he said that personality requires intersubjective relationships. It sounded like he was distinguishing personality from just being intersubjective relationships. But just that as a necessary condition for personality, one needs to be in an intersubjective relationship.
I wouldn't say that one has to be in one to have personality. What I would say is that personalities are not intelligible outside of intersubjective relationships. There's no way of understanding them. There's no way of predicating about them apart from other
Well, I mean,
minds
maybe you could
that are
define personality first, and I think that would be
sure.
more fruitful way to go about it.
Doesn't that just sound like
Sure.
an epistemological concern? I mean,
Sorry,
Yeah.
I missed that.
Yeah, I mean, if God is inscrutable, I mean, we know in part, we don't know in full, so there are, I don't think it's any good argument against personality that we can't make sense of it without intersubjectivism, just because that's how we experience that for ourselves. So I think you could have personality minus the Trinity, even if we don't understand how that could be.
I don't see how you would. For the Islamic example that you gave, you were positing an example where someone would say that their basis is the revelation of their God. Now, if the basis for their thinking is the revelation of their God, then if they don't find out who they are from that God, then they have no starting point whatsoever.
No, they would
But
do. I mean,
as,
they would do. They would do to the act of creation.
the problem with that being you can't interpret creation apart from knowing what your interpretive abilities and what it even means to interpret things like that. That just begs the question. But as
Right,
far as
so
defining humanity or personality, according to Christian theism, and the funny thing is that Islam is committed to this as well because it's found in the Tanakh. The Imago Dei is the Christian concept of personality, and at least human personality, and it's the idea that we have the ontology necessary to be representatives of God in three distinct ways. First, we're representative of God in the sense that we can communicate for ourselves and for others to God, with God about ourselves and about others. We can communicate to others, with others, about God, who He is and what He has said. And we can relate and communicate ourselves about each other in light of what God has said about us.
among other things, yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering what personality in general is that you're getting at is incompatible with non-triune views.
I wouldn't argue that. Oh, you're saying personality. I would say that, yeah, you can't. There's no account for personality. In other words, there's no way to interpret what it means to be a personal human being in relation to other human beings, what it means to be a personality, without God being triune. Because for Allah,
So you're talking about the personality of other people, not the personality of God in that example.
I'm not sure I follow that. Let me try to distinguish this again.
Like when
So
you're saying you can't make sense of personality, you were talking about making sense of the personality of yourself and others, not with respect to the personality of God. And you were saying you can't make sense of personality without the Trinity.
I mean, I don't know how you would do that either, because the concept of revelation is that God condescends, that is, He accommodates Himself to human faculties in order to reveal Himself. So if one doesn't have a concept of what it means to be human, what it means to be personal, according to that God already, then how could one interpret anything that God says in that same language?
No, I mean, that's what I'm trying to clarify. When you made the original claim that you don't think you can make sense of personality outside of the Trinity, were you just saying that we can't make sense of human personality outside of the Trinity? I thought originally you were talking about the personality of God Himself, not the personality of other people.
I was saying the personality of human beings, but it is a more general concept, so that it could be applied to Allah as well, if you want to argue that as, either way, because revelation stands or falls with God's ability to relate to human beings, and because human beings' ability to relate to each other and to relate to that revelation in human language means they have to know who they are, what it means to be human. Both fall without God's being a personal being who can ground that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, Islam doesn't deny that God is a personal being, though. I would take it.
Yeah, neither does Judaism.
Sure, but they deny that He is an interpersonal being.
What do you mean by that?
With other, yeah, they deny that with respect to a triune being. They don't deny that with respect to interpersonal relationships with its creation. In Judaism, God stoops down into creation to interact with Adam and Eve walking in the garden, and the Noah and all the other patriarchs there. So God steps down, in Judaism, and the image of God comes from Judaism, and Christianity basically, derives the same thing from there. But so in Judaism, you have us created in the image of God, and the same in Islam.
Yeah, I understand that, but what I'm pointing out is that while the Christian theistic system seems to be consistent in upholding that because their theology is triune, the Islam is not consistent in upholding that because their God cannot ground personality.
I mean, that's what we're trying to understand here. I mean, what is it about not being triune that prevents, say, Allah from being such that, people can pray to Him, He responds to prayers, He talked directly to Moses, etc., etc. How is all of that impossible if He's not triune?
well, just for an example, look at the language that you're using: praying to, talking with. How do any of those prepositional verbal phrases have meaning if there's no ground for that in God? Right. The
I guess I'm not
uniqueness of the
following what
Christian
you mean.
God is the uniqueness of the Christian God is that there's an abductive significance to the Trinity. My interaction with somebody else mimics the Trinity's interaction. It is grounded in that. It can be explained in terms of that, metaphysically speaking. But with Allah, there's no explanation as to why we can talk with Him, why we have other human beings we can talk with, why we are the type of being that can have these relationships. It's just
See,
There
it's
is.
just an
hold on a second. I don't see how that's not some objection some Muslim could raise, right? How God talks to Himself, right? Like, so I don't see how you're arguing something or you're objecting to something to Islam. You're saying, how could it be the case that if your God is not triune, that it could communicate with humans or whatever? But how is it the case that if your God is triune, it can communicate with humans? How is it the case that if your God is triune, he can communicate with himself, right?
But that wouldn't be the Trinity. God wouldn't be speaking to himself. The three persons of the Godhead would be intersubjectively interacting with each other.
Yeah, I'm not seeing what the analogical contradiction is. What is true for a human being interacting with each other is found as an absolute preconditional sort in the Trinity, as opposed to Islam, which believes that we are this kind of creature that's made for the very purpose and with the very ontology to have such relationships. And yet, nothing about Allah's ontology explains that. It's just coming into being.
Why would it need to?
Why wouldn't you just
I mean,
tell
it wouldn't
us?
necessarily have to explain it. It might be preferential. It might be it might be preferential, but there's no necessity that that there's something in the ontology of Yahweh of the Judaism or Allah of Islam which relates to that intersubjective nature of our relationships. I mean, it could just be the case that
Right.
God creates humanity, and He creates them with that faculty to intersubjectively interact with each other, even although there's no counterpart to that in God Himself. That would just be something in the nature of God which is distinct from His creation.
Right. So that's an excellent point. The issue is that if you don't have an explanatory factor in your theology for something to do with the essence of humanity, then one of two things becomes a problem. Either humanity can be defined outside of that theology, in which case, why do you believe the theology? Maybe something outside that contradicts it is the case with respect to anthropology. Or you think that things can be genuinely new with respect to human beings. That in other words, properties can just arise which have no explanation. And that is obviously absurd.
Well, he's not
because
saying
if
it
you hold
has no explanation.
Yeah.
He's just saying that
I
there's
gave
no
the
counterpart.
explanation.
Yeah, I mean, God creates us with these given faculties. I mean,
how is
presumably
that
there's
an
no
explanation?
counterpart to.
So God creates, if God creates humanity and He creates them to become a social species, then by creating them to be a social species, that's going to bring about the social interaction between those creatures.
No, but notice, okay, and Hypatia is bringing up the concept of incommunicable versus communicable attributes,
Okay.
or attributes which we share in either some degree or some analogous sense with the Creator. But the problem there is, with respect to attributes that are shared in some sense between us and God, we have them. They're there. So, and they are our essence. So, for example, it is essential to be a human being that you are a personal being. There's no such thing as a human that's impersonal.
And you're defining personality again as how? Just to clarify?
The Imago Dei.
that seems to be begging the question of what you're trying to establish, because that would be
Not at all. As you admitted, Matt, as you admitted, and I don't know what you mean by Judaism, because there's so many different sorts. There's a lot of historical.
Conservative Judaism. Well, let's go with
Okay, so
conservative
rabbinical.
Judaism.
You probably you mean rabbinical Judaism.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
with rabbinical Judaism, or non-liberal Islamic theology,
yeah.
both agree to the Imago Dei.
Of course.
Because both agree to the Tanakh.
Okay. Well, but they're not agreeing with Christianity. Judaism precedes Christianity, so the Imago Dei comes from Judaism first, and then Christianity adopts it and carries it through.
I wouldn't agree with your understanding of the history of Christianity, but to avoid that,
yeah, go ahead.
Just to address the issue of personality. There's nothing in Allah which can be provided which establishes one's personality. Now, the problem is, you can say, well, God just explains it by creating it. But that just means God can create things that have nothing to do with himself. He can create things that are completely new. He can create properties that are not grounded in his own. And if that's the case, then we have no way of knowing whether or not anything about God, including his own revelation, has anything to do with himself. Because every bit of his revelation is connected to this world. It's said in this world's terms. You basically created a layer of mysticism through which we cannot pass if God can create properties that have nothing to do with himself, or that are not grounded in his own being.
Well, I don't know if you would say that has nothing to do with himself. I mean, presumably his personality includes some dispositional aspects, which presumably we share to some extent, but even beyond that, I think what Matt was going to get at is, as far as us not knowing anything about himself, I mean, presumably that's going to be characterized in terms of general revelation with respect to the world and scripture, as far as what his character is.
Yeah, but what I pointed out about that is, as long as we take personality to have intersubjective relationships as a necessary aspect of its intelligibility, which we do as of the Imago Dei. The Imago Dei includes that one relates God to other people and relates people to God and relates to people in light of God. Those are all examples of intersubjective relationships. You could use other words.
I'm not sure they're necessary. They're necessary results of the Imago Dei. Rationality, things like that, self-awareness, consciousness, things like that. Yeah, sure, but the ability, intersubject. I mean that's why I said about the begging the question, because it would seem to be that you're trying to define being made in the image of God in such a way that it necessarily involves the only God that can exist is the Trinity, a Trinitarian God, because only a Trinitarian God. But only a Trinitarian God can have that intersubjectivity between the personalities, the persons of the Godhead.
Wait a second. What I said was that the Trinitarian God is different from the Islam God.
Yes.
And in fact doesn't have the problems that the Islamic God incurs because it is triune. I wasn't trying to argue that all worldviews necessarily fall under that particular scope of objection. But the Trinity as a general basis is very unique to Christianity, as well as the three things that I pointed out before, which are God's aseity, God's condescension, and God's grace. None of those together are concepts that you find in any other religion.
What do you mean by God's condescension? Are you talking about in Jesus Christ, or are you talking about just in creating the universe and the earth and things like that?
Yeah, and I need to take off soon here, but
cool.
I'll try to answer as many questions as I can before I leave. What I'm saying is, according to Christianity, there's the doctrine of immanence and there's the doctrine of transcendence. Transcendence has to do with God's distinction from the world, His holiness, His precedence, the fact that His existence is absolute and the world comes as dependent and derivative upon Him. Immanence has to do with God's being alike the world, because He likens the world to Himself when He creates it, and He stoops down and becomes a part of it and is a character in its history. Right? Every other religion has a doctrine of transcendence and immanence, which is untenable. In the case of Islam, conservative Islam, it has a doctrine of transcendence that destroys its doctrine of immanence. In the case of liberal Islam, it has a doctrine of immanence that destroys its transcendence. And I would argue the same thing, for example, against Arminianism.
Spell that out in more detail, please? Like take conservative Islam, for example. How is that incompatible with eminence?
How is it incompatible with? I'm sorry, what was it? Last part?
Well, I mean, first maybe
let's not tar him down in too many hard explanations. Keep in mind he's got to go soon. Poor Jimmy does.
Yeah. So maybe we should then instead return to the main point.
I mean, can I recap real quick? Yeah, let me recap real quick, because the reason Islam came up in the first place was because I was saying that it was because the argument was being made that it's arbitrary to make distinctions between, at least significant distinctions, I should say, distinctions that are relevant to epistemology between Christianity and Islam. And I mean, you're going to have to do the research for yourself, and there are men, again, 10 times endowed with 10 times my brilliance who have already stated this issue throughout history. But the reason I brought up, or the reason Islam came up, was because it was being brought up as an example of someone who can use the same kind of argumentation that I'm using in terms of significant similarities. That is, all the dissimilarities between my argument and an Islamic presuppositionalist are insignificant or irrelevant. And what I'm arguing is no, because part and parcel to my argumentation is the theology that one is arguing. My theology is triune, a Muhammadan's is not. And the issue there is that I can ground human personality. There are properties that are essential to human personality that I can ground because of the Trinity. And an Islam, or excuse me, an Islamist cannot.
Well, I guess that's what we're still not quite clear on how that functions exactly.
Yeah, and all that.
Matt gave one example of an explanation, and then you were talking about this bit about how there would be genuinely new things in the world, and that would pose some problem for us having knowledge of God's character or something. I think that's where the conversation stopped. But I think maybe another point of clarification is this bit about intersubjectivity in relation to the Imago Dei. Wouldn't we want to make a distinction there between, dispositional property and a categorical property? We might say that God dispositionally has the property of being in an intersubjective relationship, in the same way he has dispositionally the property of being the creator. At least on most theological frameworks, God didn't have to create the world. There are worlds where God exists alone, with nothing else existing apart from himself. But nonetheless, we would say that dispositionally, obviously, since he has the power to create the world, we would say he, as a disposition, could relate to the world had he made it. And likewise, he could relate to other people had he brought about other people. And likewise, we picture or reflect that dispositional aspect in God, as far as that we can relate to other people, and over and above that, there are people to which we can in fact relate.
So let me see if I understand this correctly. The difference between dispositional and categorical properties, is that the same as essential versus accidental properties then?
No, it has more to do with Aristotle's distinction between what's in potency versus what's in act. So wood is potentially hot, but it's not actually hot until you put fire to heat it up.
I
so you could say God is could potentially be in that's grounded in some power or aspect of God. That is in fact part of God in some. Well, I don't know if you say part, given the kind of simplicity, but that is of God in some sense. But that doesn't itself require that he is in fact in a relationship to have that disposition. Likewise, wood doesn't itself actually have to be hot in order for it to be potentially hot, as opposed to some other potency. And we might say that we picture or we relate to that same disposition or potency in God, to which, in our case, over and above us being able to be in an intersubjective relationship in the same way God is able to be in an intersubjective relationship. Given the existence of other persons, we are in an intersubjective relationship with others.
Yeah, what I would say is, and let me see if I can pick up a different language, because I'm not Aristotelian in my metaphysic. But if I can pick up the language of essentialism, which Calvinists are with respect to God, my point is that with respect to the essence of a human being, the essence of a human being must be grounded in God's communicable properties. That is, his properties by respect of condescending to the world and revealing who he is beyond it
I don't,
must
I
be
don't,
grounded in God.
I don't understand why you say it must be done that way.
Because right, and that's what I was going to say about Matt's explanation, is because if it's not, if our explanation is just that God by fiat creates things that have no relation either by instantiation or by negation to what God has, then God has created something that is capable of having meaning, capable of being what it is apart from who he is. And if anything can have existence from being apart from who God is, then anything can happen, because God's not the determinant of everything that is existent in reality. There are things which can just exist by virtue of the fact that they're not like God.
But didn't you say that God is transcendent? So there are things which God is distinct from creation.
Absolutely, but there's nothing in human beings which is distinct from God in the sense that it's not merely a created instantiation of something that is uncreated, or a negation of what is already existed in God. So, for example, personality, we have a derivative personality. God has an inderivative personality in the Godhead of the Trinity. There are three persons, right? In terms of sin, sin can be explained on the Christian worldview because it's the negation of God's goodness. That is not to say the absence of God's goodness, but it is an instantiation that is opposed to God's goodness. So there's still an abductive format that grounds such things. But in Islam, there is no grounding, not that I know of, not to my knowledge, of human personality, because intersubjective relationships.
The thing you say when sin,
the grounding would be the imago Dei, being created
yeah,
in the image of God, and God on Islam is a person.
And the other thing is, you say when sin, about the sin thing, how can that can be, because the Bible claimed, or Christianity claims the formation of sin. So of course you're gonna. I had it and I lost it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give more clarity to this. But the point was just to say, it's very silly to say that taking Christianity over Islam, given these arguments, is arbitrary. That's very silly. I readily admit that maybe I could write a paper that's clearer, and no doubt there are men who could have a moment of coffee with you for 30 minutes who could be clearer than I am. No doubt. However,
just interesting point there. I'm looking at a website right now, which is actually an Islam. It's called Islam Today, and it's saying that it's not a wise thing to say that Allah has a personality. It says, I do not consider it a prudent thing to say that that Allah has a personality. So that's from an Islamic source itself.
But he must have a personality. If he doesn't have a personality, how can he understand the value of mercy? And Muslims often say that Allah
They
is
just might
merciful.
mean that it's not like ours in the way that we understand human personality. So
Okay,
human
but by the same token, if we're made in the image of God and we're made to think His thoughts after Him, then it seems to me that one can work backwards and understand that God must see mercy the same way we do.
Well, I don't know if we would say see the same in precisely the same way. I mean, they might have some view in which our God's personality is analogous to the human use of the word personality, but it isn't univocal with it. But I think
But the problem is,
what they're getting at there is something more like human personalities derived from things like want and need. Presumably, God doesn't require of anything to make sense of his personality.
I'd argue with that, but I'll wait till Jimmy's gone because he's only got so much time.
yeah, this will be my last comment. I think that the important point that is being missed here is that, yes, of course, the language is not univocal. No, the Christian doesn't suggest that it's univocal. What the Christian is suggesting is that it must be analogical. That is, God's mercy must relate to human mercy in a way that provides for human mercy. And if Allah can't be stated to have things like personality, I mean, what meaning does the word personality have when applied to either? How are we supposed to use words about God if words applied to Him have no explanatory ability in terms of our daily life? And how can we use words about ourselves if the thing which creates us is so alien to us that it doesn't even have any grounding capacity for the very basis of who we are?
Do you mean like God in His divine simplicity? I mean, that's alien to us, that a being, or even a Trinitarian being, we don't know anything like that, where you can have something like a triune being. And no, that's alien to anything we can know about beings. It would only be through divine revelation that we could ever know something like that.
Before Jimmy goes, he said something earlier that I just, I'm sure he can fix it. He says, truth is what comports with the mind of God, right? Well, if you can't know the mind of God, then you can't know truth.
Exactly.
Yeah, but the Bible tells us who has the mind of God? We have the mind of God. So the Bible tells us we do have that.
That's
well,
not
you can't,
what it says.
but,
It says my thoughts are not
God's
your
ways
thoughts.
are.
Yeah,
Well,
my thoughts are not
God's
your
thoughts
thoughts.
are.
Yeah, okay,
So
hold on. I understand that. I understand the objection. Let me comment to it really quick. Yes, that is the problem with other religions. They don't have a concept of transcendence that allows God to be immanent, that allows God to relate to His people, and for them to relate to Him. And other religions don't have an idea of immanence that allows God to be different from people, that allows Him to be holier than them. All other religions fail to reconcile those two things. But with Reformed Christianity, the concept is that God reveals Himself. He stoops down. He accommodates Himself, as is best exemplified in the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who became a man, right? That's God incarnate. And so the idea that we can know God's mind, well, sure, we can't know God's mind directly, and we can never know God's mind as He thinks thoughts in eternity. That doesn't even make sense. But we can know God's mind as He stoops to reveal Himself in this world, as He accommodates human language to explain what He is like, who He is, and what history is about.
Yeah. Well, that got relatively far afield from, I guess, various theories of truth, but I guess we did manage to touch on, well, correspondence, and I suppose also a little bit of Joe's deflationary, and it's also some distinctions with the theories of knowledge and justification. I apologize for having been sidelined so long with, I guess, managerial affairs. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. The other thing, it was like Jimmy was using the Christian God as a standard and comparing everything else to that and claiming they were false because they didn't stand up to his idea of the Christian standard.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. He was presented challenges to that, and he sought to respond to those challenges by giving argumentation for the challenges that were being put to him, and I think he did a very good job of putting forward arguments in defense of what he was doing.
Well, I'm not saying he didn't. To me, it seemed like for all the arguments, he was using the Christian God as a standard and then basing everything off of that. Like when you brought up, to me what it was like when you brought up, the people going with Allah and using Allah as their, and then Judaism. Well, then he used Christianity as a basis and then compared those against Christianity, which I don't think he should have done. I think he should have just compared them on themselves, on their own merits, and said, well, this, that, and the other thing isn't a good one because of this reason. But he didn't. He used it against Christianity, which I didn't think was the right way to do it.
Yeah, that's not correct. He pointed out alleged deficiencies in Islam and Judaism where they could not explain things basic to humanity, like personality.
I didn't quite follow that argument, though.
Whether he was right in that argument's a separate issue from whether he argued that way, but he certainly put forward that argument, which was exactly what you said he should be doing, showing a deficiency in Islam, and of course that was just one area. He outlined about 3 or 4, and he also referred to the many other people who have put forward critiques of Islam.
Well, that's fine. Like I said, a lot of it was over my head. I don't study all that philosophy and all the terms. I just state that's why I stated what I said. I'm just trying to understand a little better.
Did you understand the argument by the end of that about the intersubjectivity thing?
Then slightly, but I don't think he had sufficient time to expound upon it. I initially thought he was talking about the personality of God.
Yeah, that's what I thought as well.
Making the argument that because God is triune, that there can be interactions between the persons of the Godhead, and that from those interactions you derive personality, and that's something unique to a triune God that wouldn't be found in Islam or Judaism. But then it seems to be the case that he wasn't arguing that he was more arguing that only with the triune God can you find something analogous to what we do as human beings.
Why 3? Why not just 2? I think there was a binitarianism at one point.
Because
that would allow for the social.
There's an argument for it, but I don't think most people accept it.
What is it? I'd love to hear that.
Well, Bonaventure gives this argument that there are 3 basic kinds of love: love for oneself, love between 2 people, and the shared love one has for another. So the triune God exemplifies all 3.
But that's
in simplicity and unity.
But that's a contrived argument. Basically, I mean, if Christian theology was that God is I don't know what you would say, not a trinity, but a duet. If God was a duo, then there'd be people putting forward arguments from love or something else which only had 2 things in it. And the same if there was 4 or 5 or 6, people would construct analogies from things that had 3, 4, 5, or 6 in them to try and make.
Well, I always wondered why there wouldn't be an infinity, because you could think that the shared love among 3 for 1 would be better than just 2. Something like that. And you could just extend that argument.
Yeah, I mean,
continuism from that.
Yeah, I mean, I refrained. I mean, obviously, I think one of the one of the main objections would be the actual coherency of the Trinity doctrine itself. So I think, you know, there wouldn't be much point in putting forward that, well, Christianity it should be Christianity because Christianity has the triune God, but if the triune God itself is an incoherent proposition, then that's not a plus for the triune God, that's a negative. And in fact, that would be a reason to reject that if you hold to classical logic.
I mean, I guess my sort of puzzlement came from, I mean, isn't it typically thought to be a divine mystery of some sort, even among Reformed circles?
Yeah, and that's why I never raised it, because I think he might have taken that route. But
I mean, that itself doesn't that sort of raise questions to his methodology, which was that what it seemed to be that the alternative views had greater deficiencies, or there were things they couldn't explain, let's say, like between our personality and with respect to the divine being, or other sorts of things, that there are certain brute facts, you might want to say, or certain mysteries that it can't accommodate.
wouldn't
It
he?
seems that the way he's accommodating itself requires a certain sort of mystery to make it work.
But I think he would argue analogously. So he would say, yeah, the Trinity is a Trinity, but we can, because I think he made the point that as long as we can find things in the creation which are analogous that we can talk about God through analogy. So he might take that. I think he might have taken that line of approach that we can speak of the Trinity analogously as Christian theologians have done. The famous example being William Lane Craig, when he was asked to give the best.
Cerebrus, yeah. Sure.
with Cerebrus, which, by the way, he has retracted, or not retracted, but he has qualified that as not a very good example.
Cerberus,
Yeah,
Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guards the gates of hell? Yeah, I think so.
Cerberus.
You know, when I was a Christian, I never believed in the Trinity. The Trinity seemed wrong to me. That's when I actually believed in God and Jesus. And the Holy Ghost. But it just seemed like people would pray to Jesus more than God. It seemed blasphemous.
Is that allowed?
Not blasphemous if that's what you're instructed to do by God.
Okay. Well, we have 90 seconds until the changeover, so the new join link is in the side chat.
Yeah,